harder than Thick as a Brick, I should imagine. But I have to say it was a bad album. I think it's a bit unfair. Nonetheless, Melody Maker, as the sort of Bible of the music press as it was in those days, and Chris Welch being a very influential writer, it was a very quoted review, and one that I think one way or another found its way around at a time when Melody Maker was spreading its wings and going for export sales in both in America and a lot of other countries as well. So it does a lot of harm at that particular point. But I don't think Passion Play was. I mean, you're being entirely unfair and really just glossing over it in the same way as I think so many other people do when you say it had unanimous bad reviews. They weren't unanimous whatsoever. There were a lot of mixed reviews, there were some good reviews, and there were some bad reviews, but there were one or two particularly bad ones which were the loudest. And unfortunately, one of Terry Ellis's very bad management decisions, if not his worst, although perhaps it's his second worst, we'll come on to that later, was that he decided we should reply to this bad criticism from Chris Welch and Melody Maker by giving them a headline story suggesting, or really telling them, that we had retired, we had quit as a group because of bad press. His idea being that would get us a front page story on Melody Maker and sell us more records. Well, it got the front page story on Melody Maker, but everybody just quite predictably and quite rightly said, it was just sour grapes, and we were just reacting sort of in a very infantile fashion by announcing that we were going to retire because we'd had a bad review. The band had no intention of retiring and thought that it was a pretty, dopey sort of press story to go for anyway, but, Terry was adamant and we let him put it in. Melody Maker and Ray Coleman, the editor, were daft enough to go along with it, and they printed it up as a front page story. It was wet, it was pathetic. Stupid thing to have done, didn't do us any good at all. And as I say, the band carried on, unaffected by any of that, because we'd already, booked a tour in the Far East, which we then went and did, although it was construed as that we'd disappeared from touring for a year. In fact, we hadn't at all. We were either out in America or out doing an extensive Far Eastern tour. We hadn't quit and we hadn't disappeared at all. We were just working elsewhere in the world, doing new territories we hadn't done before. So, I mean, all of that is sort of blown up out of proportion. And I have to remind you that in spite of bad press and people saying that it was a bad album or whatever, that it was number one in the American charts for a short while, and whatever its initial shipment was, and I know that it didn't sell. There were a lot of returns out of the initial shipment because of, this whole vibe about it. But it has subsequently sold well in excess of 1 million records after its bad press and over the years as a catalogue item. In other words, people having had the benefit of the test of time to aid them in deciding whether or not to purchase that copy of Passion Play have, finally decided to go and buy it. And if it's a bad album, well, it's a bad album that certainly had every opportunity to prove itself bad, and I think turned out to be reasonably good, since it sold, I can't remember what the exact figures are, but well in excess of 1 million units well after its bad press. So I think there the case must ultimately rest.
I think it's a good album.
But I don't think it's a good album. I think it's okay. But I definitely don't think it's a bad album. It has its merits and it has its shortcomings. But
well, let's move on. As you say, the case must rest. You start to work on War Child. Now, an interesting album in that it was originally conceived as the soundtrack to a movie.
Well, War Child is, if it's interesting because it was Passion Play again, basically. Slightly altered. See, Passion Play was a sort of, if you like, a kind of a notion in its sort of concept album form, which then gave rise to a movie scenario, which I put into a sort of fairly detailed synopsis form. It wasn't a full script, but I mean, it was sort of 70 pages or something of fairly detailed movie stuff. He didn't get made largely for financial reasons, although there was quite a lot of support from a few people in the movie side of things, both in terms of actors and producers and the like. But what then happened was I decided, as if you like, a musical soundtrack or another musical album around the movie which we hoped to make, to do War Child. But really the similarity in content between War Child and what was on Passion Play, I mean, they're basically the same thing. Actually, the same concept, certainly. And but of course, one being sort of fairly obscure and fairly detailed musically, the other being a conventional set of songs that had their rather conventional roles to play in a musical movie, where they were musical interludes in amongst an otherwise dramatic sort of theatrical storyline. So, but the two things are very, very related, really.
The album came out in 1974. It wasn't a concept album, though, was it? But it did, to some extent, help you to recapture a lot of the magic that you had in the early days. As you were saying about the early albums, War Child tended to give you back a little bit of the popularity that you seem to have lost.
Well, I mean, that's difficult to answer. I mean, it initially sold more copies. Its ultimate sales are still nowhere near as big as the sales of Thick as a Brick, which as a catalogue item has sold many times more records than most of them, in fact. Aqualung's probably still the single biggest seller, and when you've got a lot of strong sales from the compilation albums Living in the Past and MU. But Thick as a Brick was way ahead, more popular as an album than War Child in unit sales. Still continues to sell more than War Child, I can promise you. But War Child at the time, shipped a good number, it sold a good number. It was a fairly popular album, but it wasn't a big chart album. Indeed, we've never had big chart successes since Passion Play. The last time we had a number one anywhere.
You did have